Chapter 8 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kalinda. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 8. Rome and Parthia. Expeditions to Arabia and Ethiopia. The Arsacid dynasty, which, after the fall of the Greek Seleucids, ruled over the Iranian lands from the Euphrates to the borders of India, derived their origin from Parthia, a land situated between Media and Bactria, southeast of the Caspian Sea. Their empire is called Parthia, in contrast to the earlier Persian empire of the Achaemenids, and the later Persian empire of the Sassanids. But it must not be forgotten that these kings were of Iranian race, speaking an Iranian language, maintaining the religion of Zoroaster, and that the whole character of their court was Persian. Thus it is quite true to say that the Romans in their Parthian wars not only maintained the same cause, but fought against the same foes as Themistocles when he repulsed Xerxes, and as Alexander when he overthrew Darius. The Parthian kingdom was composed of a number of subordinate kingdoms or satrapies. The Greek cities in Mesopotamia formed an exception, to which we must add the flourishing mercantile city of Seleucia, which had taken the place of ancient Babylon. In this respect, the Parthian and Roman states have been sometimes contrasted. In the Parthian realm, dependent kingdoms were the rule, city communities the exception. In the Roman Empire, cities were the rule, dependent kingdoms the exception. Before the overthrow of their rival Mithridates, the Parthian kings regarded Rome as a friendly power. But after the victories of Pompeius, when the common enemy had fallen, Rome and Parthia stood face to face and became rivals themselves. Syria then became a Roman province, and the Euphrates was fixed by treaty as the boundary between the great European and the great Asiatic power. But there were many causes for discord. Armenia, like Cappadocia, became a Roman dependency, and this circumstance could not fail to lead to war. That country, very important to both states from a military point of view, was destined to be tossed continually backwards and forwards between Parthia and Rome. In language, society, and nationality, Armenia was far nearer to the eastern than to the western power, and the political bonds which united it to Rome were always somewhat artificial. Another source of discord lay in Atropatene, the land south of Armenia, for the vassal king of that country, desiring to free himself from Parthian supremacy, often sought to become the vassal of Rome. The actual violation of the treaty came from the Romans, who assumed overlordship over the Mesopotamian city of Edessa, and attempted to extend the borders of the dependent kingdom of Armenia into Parthian territory. How Parthia declared war against Armenia, how this led to the fatal expedition of Crassus and the field of Carrhae, how in consequence of that defeat Armenia fell into the power of the Parthians, need not be repeated here. Elated by their success, the Parthians began to demand the cession of Syria, while on the side of Rome it was regarded as a matter of honour to revenge the defeat at Carrhae and recover the standards of Crassus. The civil wars prevented the accomplishment of such designs. One great defeat indeed the enemy experienced when they invaded Syria in 38 B.C. at the hands of Ventidius Bassus. Pacorus, the son of the great king, fell on the field of Gindaros. Marcus Antonius at length seriously faced the Parthian question, in connection with his own ambitious design of founding a great eastern empire composed of dependent kingdoms. It will be remembered how his expedition came to naught. At that time the king of Parthia was Phraates, who was highly unpopular with his subjects, and Antonius supported the pretender Monesus. The king of Armenia was Artavasdes, and he, wishing to increase his dominion by the addition of Atropatene, ardently supported Antonius. Another Artavasdes was king of Atropatene. Antonius blamed the Armenian king for his failure, repaired to Armenia in 34 B.C., seized him, and carried him to Egypt, where he was put to death by Cleopatra. His son Artaxes fled to the Parthians. At the same time Antonius became reconciled with Artavasdes of Atropatene, obtained his daughter in marriage for a son of his own, whom he set up as king of Armenia. But at this moment Antonius was called upon to deal with Caesar, and Phraates, seizing the opportunity, deposed the two kings, and combined both Armenia and Atropatene under the rule of Artaxes, son of the Armenian Artavasdes. Fortunately for Roman interests, intestine struggles broke out in Persia, simultaneously with the final contest between the two Roman triumvirs. Phraates was deposed, and Tiridates was set up in his stead. Augustus has been blamed for not dealing resolutely with the Eastern question immediately after his victory over his rival. It has been said that he should have at once taken steps to plant his power in Armenia, and make that country securely and permanently Roman, at the same time establishing a recognised authority over the Colchians, the Iberians, and the Albanians, who inhabited the regions between Armenia and the Caucasus, the Euxine and the Caspian. It seemed incumbent on him, too, to recover the standards captured at Carrhae, and at the same time two exiles were imploring his help, Tiridates, who had been overthrown soon after his elevation, and Artavasdes, king of Atropatene. The desire which the Romans felt at this time to see the Parthians humbled is reflected in the earlier writings of Horace. Augustus is called Juvenis Parthis horrendus, and will be regarded as a true god upon earth if he adds the Britons and the dangerous Persians to the empire. Men clearly looked forward to a Parthian war, but Augustus, after the conquest of Egypt, postponed the settlement of the Eastern question. Perhaps he was influenced by the ill success of Antonius, and his army, doubtless eager for rewards and rest, would have been little disposed to undertake an arduous campaign in Armenia. And above all, Augustus himself was not a general. Observing the domestic discords in Parthia, he hoped to settle the eastern frontier advantageously for Rome by diplomacy and not by arms. He consoled Artavasdes with the kingdom of Lesser Armenia, and gave refuge in Syria to Tiridates. In 23 B.C. an opportunity came for recovering the standards and captives which had been taken at Carrhae. Phraates sent an embassy demanding that Tiridates should be given up to him, and also an infant son of his own, whom Tiridates had carried off. The child was sent back, but it was stipulated that in return the captives and the standards should be restored. It was in connection with this affair that Agrippa was sent to the east with proconsular imperium. Phraates did not fulfil the conditions immediately, but in 20 B.C. Augustus appeared in the east himself, and the Parthian king yielded. The Emperor was proud of his success, which in his account of his own deeds he records thus: "I compelled the Parthians to restore to me the standards and spoils of 3 Roman armies, and suppliantly to beg the friendship of the Roman people. Those standards I deposited in the temple of Mars Ultor." Poets celebrated the event as if it ranked with the most brilliant achievements of Roman arms. Virgil sings of "following Aurora and claiming the standards from the Parthians," and imagines the Euphrates as flowing with less haughty stream, and the ensigns, so peacefully recovered, are described by Horace as "torn from the enemy." In the same year a more solid success was obtained, the recovery of Armenia. A conspiracy had been formed there against the king Artaxes, and a message was sent to the Emperor requesting that Tigranes, the younger brother of Artaxes, who was educated at Rome, should be sent to reign in his stead. Tiberius, the Emperor's stepson, was entrusted with the task of deposing Artaxes and installing Tigranes. Artaxes was murdered by the party which had conspired against him, and Tigranes was established in the kingdom, which thus became once more a dependency of Rome. Atropatene, however, was separated and given to Ariobarzanes, son of its former king Artavasdes, but it seemed to have remained under Parthian supremacy. Ariobarzanes, like Tigranes, had been educated at Rome. New troubles, however, soon arose in Armenia. Tigranes died, and the kingdom was agitated by struggles between the friends of Parthia and the friends of Rome. Augustus again entrusted to his stepson the office of restoring order in Armenia, but Tiberius, from motives of private resentment, declined the commission (6 B.C.). Nothing was done during the next 4 years, but then it was decided that the ordering of the East should be entrusted to the young grandson of the Emperor, Gaius Caesar, and should form a brilliant beginning to the career of the destined Imperator. The young prince started with high hopes, dreaming perhaps of oriental conquests and of rivalling the fame of Alexander. His enthusiasm seems to have been encouraged by, perhaps to have affected, his elders. A courtly poet cried, "Now, far East, thou shalt be ours," and Juba, the literary king of Mauretania, wrote an account of Arabia for the special benefit of Gaius, whose vision was chiefly fixed on the conquest of that unconquerable land. The settlement of the Armenian question was, in the first instance, easily and peacefully accomplished. Gaius and Phrataces, the son of Phraates, met on an island in the middle of the Euphrates, and the Parthian agreed to resign his claim to Armenia. But it was still necessary to enforce submission to this decision in Armenia itself, and accordingly Gaius proceeded thither to install Ariobarzanes, son of Artavasdes. Before the walls of the fortress of Artagira he was wounded by treachery, and some months later he died of the effects of the hurt at Limyra in Lycia (4 A.D.). During the rest of the reign of Augustus no serious measures were adopted in regard to Armenia, and that state was Parthian and the Roman parties. The unfortunate death of the young Caesar put an end to the design of conquering Arabia. That enterprise had been seriously entertained by the Roman government, and actually attempted at an earlier date. The possession of southern Arabia would have been an important advantage, not like that of Armenia or Moesia for military purposes, but from a purely mercantile point of view. The chief route of trade from India to Europe was by the Red Sea. Adane (Aden) was then, as now, an important port, and the Arabians, with their born genius for commerce, had it in their hands. The Indian wares were disembarked either at Luce Come, on the west coast of Arabia, and thence transported overland to Petra and on to some Syrian port, or at Myos Hormos on the opposite Egyptian coast, whence they were carried by camels to Coptos, near Thebes, and shipped for Alexandria. Once in possession of Egypt, the Roman government could not fail to see that it would be highly profitable to command the Red Sea route entirely, and get the trade into the hands of their own subjects. Not long after the establishment of his power, Augustus took up the question, and here, for once, he was aggressive. He planned an expedition, of which the object was to reduce under Roman sway the land of Yemen, the south-western portion of the Arabian peninsula. That land was known to the Romans as Arabia Felix, and its people, the Himyarites, as the Sabsei. It was a rich country, which in itself invited conquest, though in consequence of the remote situation, the luxurious inhabitants had never been subdued, as Horace tells us, by a foreign master. They supplied the Empire with spices and perfumes, cassia, aloes, myrrh, frankincense, while in return they received the precious metals, which they kept in their land. The expedition started towards the end of 25 B.C., and was entrusted to the care of Aelius Gallus, an officer holding a high post in Egypt. 10,000 men, half the number of troops in Egypt, were placed under his command, in addition to auxiliaries supplied by the kings of Nabatea and Judea. The Nabateans had constant intercourse with Arabia Felix, and Sylleus, a minister of the Nabatean king Obodas, undertook to play the part of guide. The whole expedition was miserably mismanaged. It is hard to say how far Gallus was to blame, and how far his guide may have acted in bad faith. His friend, the geographer Strabo, from whom we learn the details of the enterprise, shifts the blame on Sylleus, and it is quite conceivable that the Nabateans may have secretly wished the expedition to fail, thinking that its success might divert the traffic that had hitherto passed through their country. The army embarked at Arsinoe, on the Isthmus of Suez, in a fleet of war vessels. Such vessels were quite needless, as there was no question of hostilities by sea. They disembarked at Luce Come, which was perhaps at this time subject to Rome, and passed the winter there. In spring they marched southwards by circuitous and laborious routes, and at length reached the capital of the Sabaeans. But the army, though the natives gave little trouble, had suffered severely from disease and hunger, and when at last they came to the residence of the Sabaean kings, Mariba, on its woody hill, both the general and the men were too exhausted and despondent to set to the task of besieging it. Having spent 6 days there, Gallus abandoned the undertaking, and the expedition returned home, but with more speed than it had gone thither. Something had been accomplished in the way of exploring the country, but the Sabsei were still, as before, unconquered. Augustus, however, did not choose to consider the expedition a failure. He speaks of it complacently among his achievements, and he promoted Aelius Gallus to the prefecture of Egypt. While half of the Egyptian army was absent on the Arabian enterprise, the other half was called upon to defend the southern frontier against the aggressions of a neighbouring power. Upper Egypt extended as far as Elephantine on the Nile, and beyond that limit lay the land of the Ethiopians, at this time ruled by the one-eyed queen Candace. She had invaded and plundered the extreme parts of Upper Egypt, Syene and Elephantine, and after fruitless demands for satisfaction, C. Petronius, the prefect, was obliged to take the field (24 B.C.) at the head of 10,000 footmen and 800 horse. He routed the enemy, took the town of Selkis on the Nile, and advanced as far as Napata, where was the queen's palace, in the neighbourhood of the Ethiopian capital Meroe. He razed Napata to the ground. He did not attempt to occupy all this country, but made a strong place, named Premnis or Premis, his advanced post. In the following year Premnis was attacked by the Ethiopians, and Petronius had to return again to relieve it. He inflicted another defeat on the foe (22 B.C.), and Candace was compelled to sue for peace. Her ambassadors were sent to Augustus, who was then at Samos, and peace was granted, the prefect being directed to evacuate the territory which he had occupied. Augustus drew the line of frontier at Syene. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Kalinda in Lüneburg, Germany, on March 4th, 2009.
Chapter 9, Sections 1 and 2 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1 by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 9, The Winning and Losing of Germany, the Death of Augustus. Sections 1 and 2. Section 1. The Conquest of Germany. The subject of the present chapter is the story of the Roman Germany that might have been. Caesar's conquest of Gaul pointed beyond the limits of that country to further conquests. It pointed beyond the sea to the island of the north, and eastward beyond the Rhine to the forests of Central Europe. Caesar had shown the way to the conquest of Britain, he had likewise crossed the Rhine. As far as Britain was concerned, Augustus did not follow out the suggestion of his "father"; that enterprise was reserved for one of his successors. But in regard to Germany he was persuaded to act otherwise. The advance of the Roman frontier from the Rhine to the Albis (Elbe), and the subjugation of the intervening peoples, must have seemed from a military point of view good policy. The line of frontier to be defended would thus be lessened. The defence of the upper Danube, from Vindonissa on the Rhine to Lauriacum, would not be needed, and the Albis would take the place of the Rhine. This project of extending the empire to the Albis, into which perhaps the cautious Emperor was persuaded by the ardour of his favourite stepson Drusus, was well begun and seemingly certain of success, when it was cut short by an untoward accident, if there is not some deeper cause in the hidden counsels of the Roman government. But the winning and losing of Germany is a most interesting episode, giving us our earliest glimpse of the rivers and forests of Central Europe. Caesar in his Commentaries has given a brief sketch of the political and social life of the Germans in general, and of the Suevians in particular. This sketch, though somewhat vague and doubtless derived chiefly from the information of Gauls, is valuable as the earliest picture of the life of our forefathers, and one written by a great statesman. He describes them as a hardy, laborious, and temperate people, dividing their life between hunting and warlike exercises. They practice agriculture but little, and subsist chiefly on flesh, milk, and cheese. No one possesses a permanent lot of land; but the chiefs assign a certain portion of land every year, and for only 1 year's occupancy, to the several communities which form a civitas. At the end of each year the allotments are given up, and each community moves elsewhere. For this custom several reasons were given, of which the most important were, that the people might not by permanent settlement become agricultural and give up warfare; that the more powerful might not drive the weaker from their possessions; and that the mass of the people might be contented. The territory of each tribe is isolated from those of its neighbours by a surrounding strip of devastated, unpeopled land. This is a safeguard against sudden attack. In time of war special commanders were chosen, but in time of peace there is no central or supreme magistracy in the state, but the chiefs of the various districts, pagi, or tribal subdivisions administer justice. The Suevi had 100 pagi, of which each furnished 1,000 men to the military host; the rest stayed at home and provided food for the warriors. The next year the warriors returned home and tilled the land, while those that stayed at home the previous year took their places. From this sketch it may be inferred that the tribes known by Caesar "were in a state of transition from the nomadic life to that of settled civilization." Some tribes must have been in a more advanced stage of development than others, and this development must have been proceeding during the age of Augustus; but we have no means of tracing it. The first disturbance in Gaul after the battle of Actium was the revolt of the Celtic Morini, in the neighbourhood of Gescoriacum (Boulogne), and their rebellion, perhaps, was in some way connected with the invasion of the German Suevians from beyond the Rhine, in the same year (29 B.C.). The Suevians were driven back, and the Morini subdued by Gaius Carrinas; while Nonius Gallus, about the same time, suppressed a rising of the Treveri, on the Mosella. The following years were marked by those measures of organisation in Gaul which have been mentioned already (Chap. VI.). There seems to have been a good deal of oppression in the taxation and dissatisfaction among the provincials. In 25 B.C. German invaders came from beyond the Rhine, and were repulsed by M. Vinicius, but we know not whether they came by the invitation of Roman subjects. More alarming was the invasion which took place 9 years later. Sugambri, Usipetes, and Tencteri, tribes whose homes were on the right bank of the lower Rhine, crossed the river on an expedition of plunder, and inflicted a defeat on the legatus, M. Lollius, carrying off the eagle of the 5th legion. This event was not a very serious loss, but it was a serious disgrace. Augustus hastened to Gaul himself, taking Tiberius with him. The question of the defence of the northern frontiers was becoming serious. Tiberius was appointed to the military command in Gaul, and offensive operations were begun by the annexation of Noricum and the conquest of Raetia and Vindelicia. In 12 B.C. Drusus succeeded his brother as commander of the Rhine army. He was a brilliant young man, hardly 25 years old, handsome, brave, and popular; of winning manners worshipped by the soldiers, ardent and bold, but a sagacious leader. He lost no time in setting about the accomplishment of his scheme of conquest beyond the Rhine, and the occasion was given to him by the hostilities of the Sugambri and their confederates. Having inaugurated the altar of Augustus at Lugudunum, and thus called forth a display of royal sentiment in Gaul, he proceeded to the lower Rhine, threw a bridge across the river, and entered the land of the Usipetes, who had already begun hostilities. This tribe dwelled on the northern bank of the Luppia, a tributary of the Rhine, which still bears the same name in the form Lippe. The land south of the Luppia belonged to the Sugambri, and southward still as far as the Laugonna, now shortened to Lahn, dwelt the Tencteri. Having quelled the Usipetes, the Roman general marched southward to chastise the Sugambri, who, under their chieftain Mello, had begun the hostilities. But at present his way did not lie further in that direction. His plan was to subdue the northern regions of Germany first, and he had decided that this must be done in connection with the navigation of the northern coast. There were 3 stages from the Rhine to the Albis. The conqueror must first advance to the Amisia, and then to the Visurgis, before he reached the Albis, his final limit. The names of these rivers, thus Latinized by Roman lips, are still the same, the Ems, the Weser, and the Elbe. A canal connecting the Rhine with Lake Flevo, as the sheet of water corresponding to the Zuider See was then called, was constructed by the army under Drusus, from whom it was named the Fossa Drusiana, so that the Rhine fleet could sail straight through the lake into the German Ocean and coast along to the mouth of the Amisia. The Batavians acknowledged without resistance the lordship of Rome, and helped the troops in cutting the canal; and the Frisians, who dwelled north east of Lake Flevo, likewise submitted to Drusus without resistance. Having thus secured the coast from the Rhine to the Amisia, he occupied the island of Burchanus, which we may certainly identify with Brocum, at the mouth of that river, and, sailing up the stream, defeated the Bructeri in a naval encounter. Returning to the sea, he invaded the land of the Chauci, who inhabited the coast regions on either side of the mouth of the Visurgis. But it does not appear whether the Roman fleet sailed as far as the Visurgis, or whether Drusus advanced into the territory of the Chauci from the Amisia. On the return voyage the ships ran some danger in the treacherous shallows, but were extricated by the friendly Frisians, who had accompanied the expedition on foot. Thus the work of Drusus in the first year of his command was the reduction of the coast of Lower Germany as far as the Visurgis. In the next year, 11 B.C., he determined to follow this up by the reduction of the inland regions in the same direction. For this purpose he had to choose another way. The chief military station on the lower Rhine was at this time Castra Vetera, situated not far from the mouth of the Luppia. Starting from here in spring, the legions crossed the Rhine, subdued once more the unruly Usipetes, threw a bridge across the Luppia, and entered the land of the Sugambri. In order to advance eastward, it was necessary to secure the tranquillity of these troublesome tribes in the rear. Then following the course of the Luppia, Drusus advanced into the land of the Cherusci, the modern Westphalia, as far as the banks of the Visurgis. It was thought that the Sugambri might have thrown obstacles in the way of this achievement, but they were fully occupied by a war with their southern neighbours, the Chatti, who dwelled about the Taunus mountains. Want of supplies and the approach of winter prevented the Romans from crossing the Visurgis. In returning, they fell into a snare, which, but for the skill of the general and the discipline of the soldiers, would have proved fatal. At a place named Arbalo, which cannot be identified, they were surrounded in a narrow pass by an ambushed enemy. But the Germans, confident in their own position, and regarding the Romans as lost men, took no precautions in attacking, and the legions cut their way through, and reached the Luppia in safety. On the banks of that river, at the point where it receives the waters of the Aliso, Drusus erected a fort, as an advanced position in the country, which was yet to be thoroughly subdued. This fort, also named Aliso, perhaps corresponds to the modern Elsen, the river being the Alm. About the same time another fort was established on Mount Taunus, in the territory of the Chatti, whom the Romans drove out of their own land into that of the Sugambri. The following year, 10 B.C., seems to have been occupied with the subjugation of the Chatti, who were fighting to recover their old homes between the Laugonna and the Moenus (Main). During this year Drusus possessed the proconsular power, that is, the secondary imperium, as it is called, subordinate to that of the Emperor, which had been conferred upon him by designation in the previous year. Soon afterwards, perhaps in the following year, along with his brother Tiberius, he received the title of imperiator. While Drusus was thus actively accomplishing his great design of a Roman Germany, he was not neglectful of the defence of the Rhine, which was secured by a line of 50 forts on the left bank, between the sea and Vindonissa. The chief station of the lower Rhine was Castra Vetera; of the upper, Moguntiacum (Mainz), probably founded by Drusus. Among the most important stations, which were established either at this time or not much later, were Argentoratum, the southern Noviomagus, which corresponds to Speyer, Borbetomagus, Bingium, Bona; the northern Noviomagus, which is still Nimeguen; and the northern Lugudunum on the Rhine, which was become Leyden, in contrast with its southern namesake on the Rhone, which has been transformed into the softer Leon. In the following year the victorious young general, who might now lay claim to the title of "subduer of Germany," entered upon his first consulship. Bad omens at Rome in the beginning of the year did not hinder the consul from setting forth in spring, to carry on his work beyond the Rhine. This time he was bent on a further progress than he had yet achieved. Hitherto he had not advanced beyond the Visurgis; it seemed now high time to press forward to the Albis itself. Starting probably from Moguntiacum, he passed through the subject land of the Chatti and entered the borders of the Suevi. Then taking a northerly direction, he reached the Cherusci and the banks of the Visurgis, and crossing that river marched to the Albis, hitting it perhaps somewhere in the neighbourhood of the modern Magdeburg. Of his adventures on this march nothing is definitely recorded, except that the Romans wasted the land, and that there were some bloody conflicts. On the bank of the Albis he erected a trophy, marking the limit of Roman progress. A strange and striking story was told of something said to have befallen him there, and to have moved him to retreat. A woman of greater than human stature stood in his way and motioned him back. "Whither so fast, insatiable Drusus? It is not given to thee to see all these things. Back! For the end of thy works and thy life is at hand." And so it fell out. The days of Drusus were numbered. Somewhere between the Sala, a tributary of the Albis, and the Visurgis, he fell from his horse and broke his leg. The injury resulted in death after 30 days' suffering. There seems to have been no competent surgeon in the army. The alarming news of the accident was soon carried to Augustus, who was then somewhere in Gaul. Tiberius, who was at Ticinum, was sent for with all haste, and with all haste he journeyed to the recesses of the German forest, and reached the camp in time to be with his brother in the last moments. The grief at this misfortune was universal. Both the Emperor and the soldiers had lost their favourite, and the state an excellent general. Drusus was not yet 30 years old. He had accomplished a great deal, and he looked forward to accomplishing far more. Perhaps nothing will enable us so well to realize his importance in history, as the reflection that, if he had lived to fulfill his plan, his work could not have been easily undone, the events which are presently to be related could not have happened, and the history of Central Europe would have been changed. The corpse was carried to the winter quarters on the Rhine and thence to Rome, where it was burned. The ashes were bestowed in the mausoleum of Augustus. 2 funeral speeches were pronounced, one in the Forum by Tiberius, the other by Augustus himself in the Flaminian Circus. Besides these solemnities, more lasting honours were decreed to the dead hero. The name Germanicus was given to the conqueror of Germany, and to his children after him. A cenotaph was built at Moguntiacum, and a triumphal arch erected to record the founder of the new province. It would seem that Moguntiacum was in some special way associated with Drusus. These monuments in stone have not come down to us, but there has survived a monument in verse, an elegy addressed to his mother, the Empress Livia. We could wish that the author of the Consolatio ad Liviam had given a more distinct picture of the qualities of the young general whom he deplores. SECT. II. — Tiberius in Germany. The Pannonian Revolt. It now devolved upon Tiberius, who possessed the proconsular power and the title of imperator, to carry on his brother's work. He took the place of Drusus as governor of the 3 Gauls and commander of the armies on the Rhine, and maintained the Roman supremacy over the half-subdued German tribes between that river and the Albis. The pacification of the Sugambri was at length effected by strong measures, and they were assigned territory on the left bank of the Rhine. Each summer the Roman legions appeared in various parts of the new province, the Roman general dealt out justice, and Roman advocates appeared beyond the Rhine. There was still much to be done to place Germany on the level of other provinces. It would have been perhaps unsafe as yet to require the Germans to contribute auxilia, or to impose on them a regular tribute. Tiberius possessed the confidence of the army, but he did not, like Drusus, possess the affection of the Emperor. In 7 B.C., the year of his second consulship, he received triumphal honours. but he did not return to Germany, and in the following year he retired to Rhodes. Little is recorded of his successors, but it is not to be assumed that they were idle or incompetent. The courtly writers of the day had eyes only for the exploits of Drusus and Tiberius, the princes of the imperial house. The consolidation of the conquests of Drusus was doubtless carried on amid frequent local rebellions, such as that in 1 B.C., which was put down by M. Vinicius. Another legatus, L. Domitius of Henobarbus, built a road, called the Pontes Longi, connecting the Amisia with the Rhine. These commanders, however, were not entrusted, like Drusus and Tiberius, with the government of the three Gauls. After the deaths of Gaius and Lucius Caesar, Tiberius was reconciled with his stepfather, and undertook the command of the armies on the Rhine once more. The legions were delighted to be commanded by a general whom they knew and trusted, whose ability was proved, and who was now marked out as the successor to the Empire. And there was a need of a strong hand, for there had been many tokens of an unruly spirit. In the first campaign, 4 A.D., Tiberius advanced beyond the Visurgis, and reduced the Cherusci, who had thrown off the Roman yoke. And for the first time the Roman army passed the winter beyond the Rhine, in the fort of Alisio on the Luppia. In the following year, 5 A.D., the lower Albis was reached, and an insurrection of the Chauci was suppressed. The Langobardi, who dwelled in these parts, and of whom we hear now for the first time, a people destined in a later age to rule in Italy, and to become famous under the name of Lombards, were also reduced. This expedition was carried out by the joint operations of a fleet and a land army. Tiberius repeated on a larger scale what Drusus had done 18 years before. But while on the earlier occasion the Roman fleet had not advanced beyond the mouth of the Visurgis, if so far, under the auspices of Tiberius it reached the Albis, and even sailed to the northern promontory of the Cimbric peninsula. Some peoples east of the Albis, such as the Semnones, the Charides, and the Cimbri, in Denmark, sent envoys seeking the friendship of the Emperor and the Roman people. The authority of Tiberius had thus pacified the trans-Rhenane dominion of Rome, and in the following year, 6 A.D., a new enterprise of conquest was entrusted to his conduct. When Drusus in his last expedition marched up the Moenus, he entered the land of the Marcomanni, and they, under the leadership of their chief Maroboduus, retreated before him into that lozenge-shaped, mountain-girt country in central Europe, which has derived its name Boiohamum, Bohemia, from the Celtic Boii, who then inhabited it. The Marcomanni dispossessed the Celts, and Maroboduus established a powerful and united state, which extended its sway eastward and northward over the neighbouring German tribes. The ideas of this remarkable man were far in advance of his countrymen. He had a leaning to Roman civilization, and he was ready to learn from it the methods and uses of political organization. He formed and disciplined in Roman fashion an army of 70,000 foot and 4,000 horse. But his policy was essentially one of peace. He desired to avoid a war with Rome, and yet to make it plain that he was quite strong enough to hold his own. He was willing to be a friendly ally, but he was not disposed to be a vassal. Geography, however, rendered a collision unavoidable. For Rome, possessing Germany in the north, and Noricum and Pannonia in the south, it would have been impossible to allow the permanent presence of an independent German state wedged in between these provinces. The actual occupation of the territory between the Dravus and the Danube, if it had not already taken place, was merely a question of time, and it was obviously necessary to have a continuous line of frontier from the Albis to the Danube. Policy demanded that the empire should absorb the realm of Maroboduus, and advance to the river Marus, now the March, which flows into the Danube below Pressburg. The legions of the Rhine under an experienced commander, Sentius Saturninus, advanced from the valley of the Moenus, breaking their way through the unknown depths of the Hercynian forest to meet the legions of the Illyricum, which Tiberius led across the Danube at Carnuntum. Both armies together numbered 12 legions, nearly double of the troops mustered by Maroboduus. And under the command of a cautious and experienced leader like Tiberius, the success of the enterprise seemed assured. But it was not to be. Before the armies met, sudden tidings of a most alarming kind imperatively recalled the general. A revolt, caused by oppressive taxation, had broken out in Dalmatia and Pannonia, and of so serious a nature that not only were the Illyric legions obliged to return, but the troops of Moesia and even forces from beyond the sea, probably from Syria, were required to assist in suppressing it. This would have been an excellent opportunity for Maroboduus to take the offensive, but he clung to his policy of neutrality, and accepted terms of peace which were proposed by Tiberius. The army of Sentius Saturninus hastened back to the Rhine to prevent a simultaneous outbreak there. The Pannonian revolt lasted for 3 years, the Dalmatian for 1 year longer. In Dalmatia the leader of the insurgents was one Bato. He made an attempt to secure Salone, but was obliged to retire severely wounded, and had to content himself with ravaging the coast of Macedonia as far south as Apollonia. The legatus of Illyricum, M. Valerius Messallinus, son of the orator Messalla, contended against him with varying success. In Pannonia another Bato, chief of the Beruci, was the most prominent leader. As the Dalmatian Bato failed to take Salone, so the Pannonian Bato failed to take Sirmium, and was defeated before its walls by Aulus Caecina Severus, the legatus of Moesia, who had hurried to the scene of action. After this the two Batos seem to have joined forces and taken up a strong position on Mount Almus, close to Sirmium. Tiberius passed the winter in Siscia, and made that place the basis of his operations in Pannonia. As many as 15 legions were ultimately collected in the rebellious provinces under his command, and the royal princes of Thrace had also come to the rescue. An unusually large number of auxiliary troops, fully 90,000, were employed in this war. Terror was felt not only in Macedonia, but even in Italy and Rome. Augustus himself had hastened to Ariminum, to be near the seat of war. Levies were raised in Italy and placed under Germanicus, the son of Drusus, a youth of 21 years. In 7 A.D. the course of the hostilities was desultory. The rebels avoided engagements in the open field. Germanicus advanced from Siscia along the river Una into western Dalmatia, and conquered the tribe of the Mese, who dwelled in the extreme west of modern Bosnia. Subsequently, 7 to 8 A.D., he captured 3 important strongholds, which seem to have been situated on the borders of Liburnia and Iepidia. The next serious event was the long siege of Arduba, in southeastern Dalmatia, which was marked by the heroic obstinacy of the women, who, when the place was captured, threw themselves and their children into the fire. But in the following autumn the Pannonian Bato was induced to betray his cause. He surrendered in a battle fought at the stream of Bathinus, August 3rd, and handed over his colleague and rival Pinnes to Tiberius, who in turn recognized him as prince of the Breuci. But his treachery did not go unpunished. He was caught and put to death by his Dalmatian namesake. Germanicus hastened in person to carry the news of the Bathinus to Augustus at Ariminum, and the Emperor returned to Rome, where he was received with thank offerings. But although this victory practically determined the end of the war, Tiberius was obliged in the following year to bring his forces again into the field against the Dalmatians, and Bato, besieged in his last refuge, Andatrium, near Salone, at length gave up the desperate cause, and was sent as a prisoner to Ravenna, where he died. When he was led before Tiberius, and was asked why he had rebelled, he replied, "It is your doing, in that ye send not dogs or shepherds to guard your sheep, but wolves to prey on them." Germanicus, who had taken part in the suppression of this dangerous and tedious war, the hardest, it was said, since the war with Hannibal, showed high promise of future distinction, and, like his father, was a universal favourite. Triumphal ornaments were granted to him, and he was placed first in the rank of praetorians in the senate. To Tiberius himself the senate decreed a triumph, but it was not destined to be celebrated. The people had hardly time to realize the successes of the legions of the Danube when the news came of a terrible disaster which had befallen the legions of the Rhine. End of chapter 9, sections 1 and 2. Sections 3 to 4 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 9, The Winning and Losing of Germany, the Death of Augustus, Sections 3 and 4. Section 3, The German Rebellion and Defeat of Varus. The Emperor seems to have entertained few fears of the possibility of a rising in his new German province, for he named as commander of the Rhine armies a man distantly related to himself by marriage, who had no experience of active warfare and was quite incompetent to meet any grave emergency. This was Publius Quinctilius Varus, who, as imperial legatus in Syria, had won wealth, if not fame. It was said that when he came to that province he was poor and Syria was rich, but when he went, he was rich and Syria was poor. His experiences as governor of Syria proved unlucky for him as governor in Germany. He utterly misconceived the situation. He imagined that the policy which he had successfully pursued in Syria might be adopted equally well in Germany. He failed to perceive the differences between the two cases, and to mark the weak grasp with which Rome, as yet, held the lands between the Rhine and the Albis. He seems to have felt himself perfectly safe in the wild places of Germany under the shield of the Roman name. He imposed taxes on the natives and dealt judgment without any fear of consequences. But a storm was brewing under his very eyes. It seemed to those German patriots, who could never brook with patience the rule of a foreign master, that the moment had come when a struggle for the liberty of their nation might be attempted with some chance of success. In this enterprise only 4 prominent German peoples were concerned, the Cherusci, the Chatti, the Marsi, and the Bructeri, the same who had before distinguished themselves by their opposition to Drusus. The Frisians, the Chauci, the Suevic peoples who acknowledged the overlordship of Maroboduus, took no part in this insurrection. The plotter and leader of the rebellion was the Cheruscan prince Arminius, son of Sigimer, then in the 26th year of his age. He and his father Flavius had received the privilege of Roman citizenship from Augustus. He had been raised to the equestrian rank, and had seen military service under the Roman standard. He was not only physically brave, but it was thought that he possessed intellectual qualities unequal in a barbarian. The Romans naturally trusted his loyalty, and the insinuations of Segestes his countryman, who knew him better, received no attention. Sigimer, the brother, and Segimund, the son of this Segestes, threw themselves into the enterprise of Arminius, and Thusnelda, the daughter of Segestes, married the young patriot against the wishes of her father. It was the policy of the contrivers of the insurrection to keep the design dark until the last moment, and in the meantime to lull Varus, already secure, into a security still more complete. Of the 5 Germanic legions, 2 had their winter quarters at Moguntiacum, the other 3 at Castra Vetera on the lower Rhine, or at the fortress of Aliso on the Luppia. In summer they used sometimes to visit the interior parts of the province, and, in 9 A.D., Varus, with 3 legions, occupied summer quarters on the Visurgis, probably not far from the modern town of Minden and the Porta Westphalica. The camp was full of advocates and clients, and the chief conspirators were present, on intimate terms with the governor and constantly dining with him. Autumn came, and as the rainy season approached, Varus prepared to retrace his steps westward. There can be no doubt that a line of communication connected his summer station with Aliso, and, if the army had returned as it came, Arminius could hardly have been successful in his plans. But a message suddenly arrived that a distant tribe had revolted, and Varus decided to take a roundabout way homewards in order to suppress it. This news was suspiciously opportune for the rebels. The Romans had to make their way through a hilly district of pathless forests, and their difficulties were increased not only by the encumbrances of heavy baggage and camp followers, but by the heavy rains, which had already begun and made the ground slippery. The moment had come for the German patriots to strike a desperate blow for independence. Segestes warned Varus of the impending danger, but the infatuated governor trusted the asseverations of Arminius. As the legions were making their laborious way through the Saltus Teutoburgiensis, they were assailed by the confederate insurgents. This Teutoburg forest cannot be identified with any certainty, but it seems to have been somewhere between the Amisia and the Lupia, northeast of Aliso. It is impossible to determine how far the circumstances of the case and how far the incompetence of the general were to blame for the disaster which followed. For 3 days the Romans continued to advance, resisting as well as they could the attacks of the foe, and if Varus had possessed the confidence of his soldiers and known how to hold them together, it seems probable that he might have passed through the danger in safety. But both officers and soldiers were demoralized under his command. The prefect of the horse deserted his post, taking all the cavalry with him, and leaving the foot soldiers to their fate. Varus was the first to despair. He had received a wound, and he slew himself. Others followed his example, and the rest surrendered. The prisoners were slain, some buried alive, some crucified, some sacrificed on the altars. The forces of Varus consisted of 3 legions, 17th, 18th, 19th, 6 cohorts, and 3 squadrons of cavalry. The army had been weakened by the loss of detachments, which, at the request of the conspirators, had been sent to the territories of various tribes to preserve order. These detachments, taken chiefly from the auxiliary cohorts, were slaughtered when the insurrection broke out. Of the troops which were entrapped in the Teutoburg forest, numbering probably almost 20,000 men, only the cavalry escaped and a few individual foot soldiers. The 3 eagles of the 3 legions fell into the hands of the victors. Such a disaster had not befallen since the day of Carrhae. The peoples of central Germany from the Rhine to the Visurgis had thus thrown off the Roman yoke. The cause of freedom had been victorious. 2 results, fraught with great danger to the Roman Empire, seemed likely to follow. It was to be feared that the triumphant Germans would push across to the left bank of the Rhine, arouse a revolt there, and perhaps shake the fidelity of Gaul. And seemingly it was to be feared that Maroboduus, lord of the Marcomanni, and chief of the Suevic confederacy, would declare himself on the side of the insurgents, now they were successful. But neither of these dangers were realized. The first was foiled by the bravery of Lucius Caedicius, commander of the garrison in Aliso, and the promptness of Lucius Nonius Asprenas, who commanded the 2 legions stationed at Moguntiacum. The first movement of the rebels after their victory was to attack Aliso, but Caedicius defended it so bravely that they were obliged to blockade it. When provisions ran short and no relief came, the garrison stole out on a dark night, and made their way, harassed by the attacks of the enemy, to Castra Vetera. Thither Asprenas, when the news of the disaster reached him, had hastened with his 2 legions, to hinder the Germans from crossing the Rhine. The other danger was frustrated by the peculiar temper of Maroboduus himself. Arminius had triumphantly sent him the head of Varus as a token of his own amazing success, hoping to persuade him to join the confederacy against Rome. But the message was ineffectual. Maroboduus refused to link himself with the insurgents or to depart from his policy of neutrality. When the news of the defeat reached Rome, Augustus met the emergency with spirit and energy. The citizens seemed indifferent to the crisis. Many of them refused to place their names on the military roll, and the Emperor was obliged to resort to fines and threats of severer punishment. Troops hastily levied from the veterans and freedmen were sent with all speed to the Rhine, and the Germans, who served as an imperial bodyguard, were disarmed and driven forth from Rome. In the following year, 10 A.D., Tiberius assumed the command of the Rhine army, which was increased to 8 legions. 4 of these were doubtless stationed at Moguntiacum, and 4 at Vetera, and it was probably the Emperor's intention that when the immediate crisis was past, the command of the Germanic armies should be divided between two generals. During the first year Tiberius seems to have been engaged in organizing the defence of the Rhine, restoring the confidence of the old legions, and establishing discipline among the new. In the next year, 11 A.D., he crossed the river, and spent the summer in Germany, but he does not seem to have ventured far into the country, or to have attempted any hostile enterprise. He was accompanied by his nephew Germanicus, to whom proconsular powers had been granted. In the following year the duties of his consulship retained Germanicus at Rome, but in 13 A.D. he succeeded Tiberius in the sole command on the Rhine. During these years nothing was done against the Germans, though the state of war still continued. But Germanicus was not long content with inactivity. Upon him seemed to devolve the duty of restoring his father's work, which had been so disastrously demolished, and he burned to do it. But his efforts to recover the lost dominion and reach the Albis once more must form the subject of another chapter. SECT. IV. — THE DEATH OF AUGUSTUS. The slaughter of the Varian legions in the wilds of Germany tarnished the lustre of Roman arms, and cast a certain gloom over the last days of the Augustan age. The Emperor himself, now stricken in years, felt the blow painfully. He let his hair and beard grow long. It is said that he dashed his head against the walls of his chamber, crying, "Varus, Varus, give me back my legions." Every year he went into mourning on the anniversary of the defeat. He knew that his end must soon come, and he began to set his house in order. In 12 A.D. he addressed a letter to the senate, in which he commended Germanicus to its protection, and commended the senate itself to the vigilance of Tiberius. In the following year he assumed once more the proconsular power for a period of 10 years. At the same time, as has been recorded in Chapter 4, Tiberius was raised to a position almost equal to that of the Emperor himself, and his son Drusus received a privilege of standing for the consulship in 3 years, without the preliminary step of the praetorship. A census was held in 14 A.D., and after its completion Tiberius set out for Illyricum, where he was to resume the supreme command. Augustus accompanied him as far as Beneventum, but in returning to the Campanian coast was attacked by dysentery and died at Nola, August 19. Tiberius had been sent for without delay, and came, perhaps in time to hear the parting words of his stepfather. There is no good reason to believe the insinuation that the Emperor's death was caused or hastened by poison administered by Livia. Her son's accession was sure, and Augustus was old and weak, so that it would hardly have been worth while to commit this crime. Both contemporaries and posterity had good cause to regard Augustus as a benefactor. He had given them the gift of peace. They also esteemed him fortunate (felix), and his good fortune became almost proverbial. Yet it has been truly remarked that luck was the one thing that failed him. Both points of view are true. He was unusually fortunate. When he entered upon his career as a competitor for power, his motives were probably as vulgar as those of his rivals. There is no reason to suppose that in the pursuit of ambition he had large views of political reform or an exalted ideal of statesmanship. His actions throughout the civil war indicate the shrewd, cool, and collected mind. They give no token of wide views, no promise of the future greatness. "But his intellect expanded with his fortunes, and his soul grew with his intellect." When he came to be supreme ruler, he rose to the position. He learned to take a large view of the functions of the lord of the Roman world, and there was born in him a spirit of enthusiasm for the work which history set him to accomplish. He knew too how to bear his fortune with dignity. But he was unlucky when his fortune was most firmly established. It was not given to the founder of the Empire to leave a successor of his own blood, and, as we have seen, his endeavours to settle the succession were doomed to one bitter disappointment after another, and led to domestic unhappiness. And it was not given to him to establish a secure frontier for the northern provinces of the Empire. The efforts in that direction, which were made under his auspices and seemed on the eve of being crowned with success, were undone by a stroke of bad luck. Yet, reviewing his whole career as a statesman and reflecting on all that he achieved, we may assuredly say that the divine Augustus was fortunate with a measure of good fortune that is rarely bestowed on men who live out their life. The written memorial of his own acts, which Augustus composed before his death, may be spoken of here. It has been incompletely preserved in a Latin inscription, which covers the walls of the pronaos of a temple of Augustus at Ancyra. Owing to this accident it is generally known as the Monumentum Ancyranum, but its proper title was Res Gestae Dini Augusti. Fragments of the Greek text of the same work have also been found in Pisidia, and have helped scholars in restoring the sense, where the Latin fails. In this document, the Emperor briefly describes his acts from his 19th to his 77th year, with remarkable dignity, reserve, and moderation. The great historical value of this memorial, composed by the founder of the Empire himself, need hardly be pointed out. An extract will give an idea of the way in which the great statesman wrote the brief chronicle of the history which he made. "I extended the frontiers," he says, "of all those provinces of the Roman people, on whose borders there were nations not subject to our empire. I pacified the provinces of the Gauls, and the Spains, and Germany, from Gades to the mouth of the Albis. I reduced to a state of peace the Alps, from the district which is nearest the Adriatic Sea to the Tuscan Sea, without wrongful aggressions on any nation. My fleet navigated the ocean from the mouth of the Rhine eastward, as far as the borders of the Cimbri, whither no Roman before ever passed either by land or sea; and the Cimbri, the Charides, and the Simones, and other German peoples of the same region, sought the friendship of me and the Roman people. By my command and under my auspices 2 armies were sent, almost at the same time, to Ethiopia and to Arabia, called Eudaemon Felix, and very large forces of the enemies in both countries were cut to pieces in battle, and many towns taken. The invaders of Ethiopia advanced as far as the town of Nabata, very near Meroe. The army which invaded Arabia marched into the territory of the Sabbae, as far as the town of Mariba." Another work compiled by Augustus was the Breviarium Imperii, containing a short statement of all the resources of the Roman state, and including the number of the population of citizens, subjects, and allies. It was in fact a handbook to the statistics of the Roman Empire. At the end of this work he recorded his solemn advice to succeeding sovereigns, not to attempt to extend the boundaries of the Empire. End of Chapter 9, sections 3 and 4.
Of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kalinda. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 10. Rome under Augustus. His buildings. The Augustan age marks a new period in the history of the city of Rome. Augustus boasted that he found it a city of brick and left it a city of marble. For the change consisted not only in the large number of new buildings which were erected under his auspices, but in the material which was used. The white marble quarries of Luna had been recently discovered, and this rich stone was employed in many of the public edifices, while the aristocrats, stimulated by the example of the Emperor, used bright travertine to adorn the facades of their private houses. The most striking change that took place in the appearance of the city during the reign of Augustus was the transformation of the Forum, and the opening up of the adjacent quarters. In this, as in so much else, Julius Caesar had suggested innovations which he did not live to carry out himself. The Roman Forum extends from the foot of the Capitol to the northwest corner of the Palatine. Adjoining it on the north side, but separated from it by the rostrum, was the Comitium, a small enclosed space in which the Curia stood. The first step to the transformation of the Forum was the removal of the rostrum (42 B.C.), so that the Forum and Comitium formed one place. The Curia had been burnt down 10 years before, and Caesar began the building of a new one, which was finished by Augustus and dedicated under the name of Curia Julia. But this was only the beginning of the new splendour that was to come upon the great centre of Roman life. A short description of the chief buildings which adorned it at the death of Augustus will show how much it was changed under the auspices of the first Princeps. At the north-west corner, close under the Capitoline, where the ascent to the Arx begins, stood the Temple of Concord, rebuilt by Tiberius in 10 A.D., and dedicated in the name of himself and his dead brother Drusus as Aedes Concordiae Augustae. Owing to the nature of the ground, this temple had a peculiar cramped shape, the pronaos being only half as broad as the cella. Adjacent on the south side was the Temple of Saturn, between the Clivus Capitolinus and the Vicus Jugarius. It was built anew in 42 B.C. by the munificence of Munatius Plancus. The 8 Ionic pillars which still mark the spot where it stood date from a later period. This temple served as the state treasury, which was therefore called the Serrarium Saturni. Between the Vicus Jugarius and the Vicus Tuscus, occupying the greater part of the south side of the Forum, stood the Basilica Julia, which, like the Curia, the elder Caesar had left to his son to finish. Begun in 54 B.C., it was dedicated in 46, but after its completion, some years later, it was burnt down. Then it arose again on a larger and more splendid scale, and was finally dedicated by Augustus a few months before his death, in the name of his unfortunate grandsons Gaius and Lucius Caesar. East of the basilica, on the other side of the Vicus Tuscus, was situated the Temple of Castor, of which 3 Corinthian columns and a splendid Greek entablature still stand. Founded originally in memory of the help which the great twin brethren were said to have given to the Romans at Lake Regillus, it was renewed for the second time by Tiberius, under the auspices of Augustus, and, like the Temple of Concord, dedicated in the name of the 2 sons of Livia. The Temple of the divine Julius, built on the spot where his body had been burned by the piety of his son, stood at the eastern end of the Forum, facing the new rostra which had been erected at the western side in front of the Temple of Concord. Behind the Aedes Divi Julii, and on the north side of the venerable round Temple of Vesta, was the Regia, a foundation of high antiquity, ascribed to Numa, and used under the Republic as the office of the Pontifex Maximus. It had been often destroyed by fire, and in 36 B.C. it was rebuilt in splendid style by C. Domitius Calvinus, and there Lepidus transacted the duties of his pontifical office. But when Augustus himself became chief pontiff (12 B.C.), he resigned the Regia to the use of the Vestal Virgins. On the north side, east of the Curia, stood a building originally designed in 179 B.C. by the censors Fulvius and Aemilius, but built anew by L. Aemilius Paulus in 54 B.C., and since then known as the Basilica Aemilia. Burnt down 40 years later, it was rebuilt by Augustus, with pillars of Phrygian marble. The Temple of Janus, which Augustus thrice closed, stood somewhere — the exact position is uncertain — near the point where the Argiletum entered the Forum, between the Curia and the Basilica Aemilia. The Argiletum, a street famous for booksellers, traversed the populous and busy region north of the Forum, which was densely packed with houses, and threaded only by narrow streets. Caesar formed the design of opening up this crowded quarter, and establishing a free communication, on this side, between the Forum and the great suburb of Rome, the Campus Martius. In order to effect this, he constructed a new market place. It was owing probably to this scheme that the Curia Julia, whose building began about the same time (54 B.C.), was built nearer to the Forum than the old Curia. The Forum Julium, as it was called, lay north of the Curia, and, like it, was dedicated (46 B.C.), before completion, and finished after Caesar's death. The chief building which adorned it was the Temple of Venus Genetrix, mother of the Julian race, which Caesar had vowed at the battle of Pharsalia. As the elder Caesar had made a vow at Pharsalia, so the younger Caesar made a vow at Philippi. The vow was to Mars Ultor, and was duly fulfilled. The house of Mars the Avenger likewise became the centre of a new Forum. This temple, dedicated by its founder on the first of his own month, in 2 B.C., served as the resting place of the standards which his diplomacy had recovered from the Parthians. The Forum Augustum adjoined that of Caesar on the north east side. It was rectangular in shape, but on the east and west sides there were semicircular spaces with porticoes, in which the statues of Roman generals in triumphal robes were set up. It became the practice that in this Forum the members of the imperial family should assume the toga virilis, and when victorious generals were honoured by statues of bronze, they were set up here. These fora of the first Caesars, father and son, were the beginning of a rehabilitation of this quarter of the city, which was resumed a century later by the Emperors Nerva and Trajan, and they established an easy communication between the Forum and the Field of Mars. Hitherto the way from the Campus to the Forum had been round by the west and south sides of the Capitoline, through the Porta Carmentalis. The Campus Martius itself, whether taken in the wider or the narrower sense, put on a new aspect under the auspices of the Caesars. The Campus, in the stricter sense, was bounded on the south by the Circus Flaminius, and on the east by the Via Lata. It was the great rival of Caesar who set the example of building on this ground. In 55 B.C. Pompey erected his marble theatre. Caesar began the construction of a marble septa, an enclosure for the voting of the centuries, which was finished by Agrippa. The name of Agrippa has more claim to be associated with the Field of Mars than either Caesar's or Pompey's. The construction of the Pantheon, which is preserved to the present day, was due to his enterprise. This edifice is of circular form and crowned with a dome, which was originally covered with tiles of gilt bronze. The dome is an instance of the extraordinarily skilful use of concrete by the Romans. It is cast in one solid mass, and is as free from lateral thrust as if it were cut out of one block of stone. Though having the arch form, it is in no way constructed on the principle of the arch. The building is lighted only from the top. The interior measures 132 feet in diameter as well as in height. The walls are broken by 7 niches, 3 semicircular, and alternating with them 3 rectangular, wherein, at a later period, splendid marble columns with entablatures were introduced. Above this rises an attica with pilasters, the original portion of which has undoubtedly been changed, since we know that Diogenes Caryatides once rose above the entablatures of the columns, and divided the apertures of the great niches. Above the attica rises in the form of a hemisphere the enormous dome, which has an opening in the top 26 feet in diameter, through which a flood of light pours into the space beneath. Its simple regularity, the beauty of its parts, the magnificence of the materials employed, the quiet harmony resulting from the method of illumination, give to the interior a solemnly sublime character which has hardly been impaired even by the subsequent somewhat inharmonious alterations. These have especially affected the dome, the beautiful and effectively graded panels of which were formerly richly adorned with bronze ornaments. Only the splendid columns of yellow marble (giallo antico), with white marble capitals and bases, and the marble decorations of the lower walls, bear witness to the earlier magnificence of the building. The porch is adorned with 16 Corinthian columns. Agrippa also built the adjacent baths called after him Thermae Agrippae (27 and 25 B.C.), and a basilica which he dedicated to Neptune in memory of his naval victories, and enclosed with a portico, which from the pictures adorning it was called the Portico of the Argonauts. Another wealthy noble of the day, Statilius Taurus, constructed the first stone amphitheatre in Rome, and its site too was somewhere in the Field of Mars. The first Princeps himself seemed content to leave the adornment of the campus chiefly to the munificence of his lesser fellow citizens. But much further north than all the buildings which have been mentioned, where the campus becomes narrow by the approach of the Via Flaminia to the river, he built a great mausoleum for the Julian family, a round structure surmounted by a statue of himself. On the south side of the Flaminian Circus, in the Prata Flaminia, a region which might be included in the campus, in a wider sense of the name, Augustus erected the Porticus Octaviae in the name of his sister, and attached to it a library and a collection of works of art. It was close to the Templum Herculis Musarum, built by Fulvius Nobilior, the patron of the poet Ennius, and renewed under Augustus, and surrounded by a portico which was dedicated as the Porticus Philippi, in honour of L. Marcius Philippus, the stepfather of the Emperor. Near the portico of Octavia were the theatres of Balbus and Marcellus, both dedicated in the same year, 11 B.C. The first was one of those works which the rich men of the day executed through the influence and example of Augustus. The second had been begun by Caesar, but was finished by Augustus, and dedicated in the name of his nephew Marcellus. The Porticus Octavii, close to the Flaminian Circus, which was dedicated by C. Octavius after the victory over Perseus, was burnt down and restored under Augustus. It was remarkable as the earliest example of Corinthian pillars at Rome. From the Forum the Clivus Capitolinus, passing the Temple of Saturn, led up to the saddle of the Mons Capitolinus, the smallest of all the mountains of Rome. Thence it ascended to the southern height, called specially the Capitolium, the citadel of Servian Rome, where the treaties with foreign nations were kept, and triumphal spoils were dedicated. Another path led up to the northern height, the Arx, which underwent little change under the Empire. But on the southern hill it was otherwise. There new buildings arose under the auspices of Augustus. The highest part of the hill was occupied by the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, in which the senate used to meet on certain solemn occasions. This temple, burned down in 83 B.C., had been rebuilt, but it required and received costly repairs in the time of Augustus. Ranged around it on lower ground were many lesser temples, of which that of Jupiter Feretrius, to whom Romulus dedicated his Spolia Opima, and that of Fides, founded by Numa, may be specially mentioned. Augustus increased their number. In 20 B.C. he dedicated the round temple of Mars Ultor, and in 22 B.C. that of Jupiter Tonans, in memory of an occasion during his Cantabrian expedition, on which he had narrowly escaped death by lightning. This temple, marvellous for its splendour, attracted multitudes of visitors and worshippers, and its position at the point where the Clivus reached the Area Capitolina might suggest that Jupiter Tonans was a sort of gatekeeper for the greater Jupiter on the summit. But the Palatine Mount was the centre from which the development of Rome went out. It was the original Rome, the Roma Quadrata, where were localised the legends of its foundation. There were to be seen the Casa Romuli, the Lupercal where Romulus and Remus were fed by the wolf, the cornel tree, and the Mundus, receptacle of those things which at the foundation of the city were buried to ensure its prosperity. Under the Republic, the Palatine was the quarter where the great nobles and public men lived. Augustus himself was born there, and there he built his house. So it came about that the name, which designated the city of Rome in its earliest shape, Palatium, became the name of the private residence of its first citizen. The palace of Augustus was a magnificent building in the new and costly style which had only recently been introduced in Rome. Ovid, standing in imagination by the temple of Jupiter Stator, where the Palatine hill slopes down to the Via Sacra, could see the splendid front of the palace, worthy of a god. Singula dum miror video fulgentibus armis, conspicuos postes tectaque digna Deo. The other great building by which Augustus transformed the appearance of the Palatine was the Temple of Apollo, begun in 36 B.C., after the end of the war with Sextus Pompeius, and dedicated 8 years later. It was an 8-pillared peripteros, built of the white marble of Luna, and richly adorned with works of art. The chief sight was the colossus of bronze, representing Augustus himself under the form of Apollo. Between the columns stood the statues of the 50 Danaids, and over against them their wooers, the sons of Aegyptus, mounted on horseback. Under the statue of the god were deposited in a vault the Sibylline books. In the porticos were 2 libraries, one Latin and one Greek. On the northern slope of the Palatine, facing the Capitol, stood the Temple of Augustus, which Tiberius and the Empress Livia erected in his honour after his death. On the south side the Palatine looks down on the Circus Maximus, which was restored by Augustus. Opposite rises the Aventine, a hill long uninhabited, and afterwards chiefly a plebeian quarter, on which the chief shrine was the Temple of Diana, whence the hill was sometimes called Collis Dianae. This temple was rebuilt by L. Cornificius under Augustus, who himself restored the sanctuaries of Minerva, Juno Regina, and Jupiter Libertas on the same hill. Livy was hardly guilty of exaggeration when he called Augustus the founder and restorer of all the temples of Rome. A word must be said here about the triumphal arch, Arcus Triumphalis, which was a characteristic feature in the external appearance of Rome and other important cities of the Empire. Under this name are included not only arches erected in honour of victories, but also those which celebrate other public achievements. A triumphal arch was built across a street, It consisted either of a single archway, or of a large central and two side ones, or sometimes of two of the same height side by side. There were generally columns against the piers, supporting an entablature, and each facade was ornamented with low reliefs. Above all rose an attica with the inscription, and upon it were placed the trophies in case the arch commemorated a victory. The arch of Augustus at Ariminum, erected in memory of the completion of the Via Flaminia, and his arches at Augusta Praetoria and Susa, still stand. The general appearance of the arch resembles that of the gate of a city, and it seems to have owed its origin to the triumphal gate through which a victorious general led his army into Rome to celebrate his triumph. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Kalinda in Lüneburg, Germany, on March 21st, 2009.